This next session, India's Strategy as an Emerging Great Power, there are no slides for, but there will be lots of robust discussion, I'm sure. So I would like to introduce James Crabtree. He is the Executive Director of the International Institute for Strategic Studies in Asia. He's also a professor at the Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy, which many of you are familiar with. His 2018 book, The Billionaire Raj, was a finalist for Book of the Year on the FT McKinsey list. And before joining academia, he is a former journalist. So he once was a recovering journalist. Most recently as Mumbai bureau chief for the Financial Times. Next to him is Amitendu Palit, senior research fellow and research lead on trade and economics at the Institute of South Asian Studies at the National University of Singapore. He is an economist specializing in international trade. He's an expert on the Indian economy and has been involved in the World Economic Forum on their Future Council for Trade and Investment. He is not a journalist, but has written columns in multiple publications. Hinrich, as I just found out, but also BBC, Bloomberg News, Channel News Asia, CNBC, ABC, and the list goes on. So this is a very, very high expertise panel here, and I'm going to let Amitendu kick us off. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you so much, guys. Hope I'm audible, and I hope, you had a good lunch. I mean, one good thing about Singapore lunches is that they don't put you to sleep. They actually tend to wake you up. So that's one of the reasons why Singapore remains productive after lunch as well, compared with many other countries of the world. And I hope you didn't get put off by so much of the alphabets in my introduction, the ABC, BBC, CBC, CNBC, because talking about trade always brings us into the alphabet soup. There's so much of abbreviation that we use. And today, of course, great pleasure. Thank you, Anne. Thank you, the National Press Foundation. Thank you, Hinrich Foundation, for this opportunity. It's James and I have known each other for quite some time, but this is the first time we are sitting together on a panel, I think, which is good. And I think we are in agreement with the fact that we are not showing any slides because India can't be slided, So that's something that I think we have there in common. Look, the way I think I'm going to bring you into this is that you're a bunch of guys who know a lot. You are on the ground. You have been covering trade, and there's not really a lot that I can bring you into insofar as issues that are unknown to you. But let me take a big picture view of this, and let me look at India as an actor in global trade from outside, how it looks like. So if one just pushes back a bit, not too far, the 1990s, the last decade, and you find India in a very different mode. The Cold War has ended. The Berlin Wall has come down. There's economic globalization all over. The rules of the world order are changing. Rules of trade are changing. The GATT is giving way to the WTO, and India is playing an extremely important and active role in the discussions that are coming out, the voice of the global south, and so on and so forth. Then comes the new century, and in between, India is reforming economically. Internally, India is reforming, getting connected to those parts of the world with whom it had very limited engagement. In principle, Southeast Asia and Northeast Asia. Then comes to 2000, and there's a series of trade agreements which it starts negotiating. Not that these are very comprehensive in scope, but that was also a point of time in the world when free trade agreements were not really known for their comprehensiveness. They were kind of in addition to what the WTO was doing at its own level. So we had those experiments going on in the APEC as well, which were more of a voluntary guide, talking to each other, bringing down trade barriers, trying to simplify movement of goods and knowledge and capital across the borders. And India starts negotiating with small steps, first with Thailand, then with Sri Lanka, gets on upward into bigger territory. I mean, games played by the big boys. So starts off with Singapore, then starts negotiating with ASEAN, talks to Japan, talks to Korea. And what you find by the early part of the decade of 2020s is that India surprisingly has got quite a few free trade agreements under its belt. So you have the Japan agreement, you have the Korea agreement, you have the ASEAN agreement, you have the Singapore and the Malaysia bilaterals and a few others. It's still talking Turkey in some sense in the WTO, but the WTO by this time has reached a dead end post-2008 after that famous summit where, India and China and the US and Europe could not agree upon what would be the import surge, which would decide upon a trigger for the special protective mechanism of tariffs to kick in. From that point in time, the WTO really ground to a halt on a large number. The decade of 2010, beginning from 2012 onward, I would say, marked a different period in India's trade history. And this was what I typically describe as a period of reticence and disengagement. So, slowly find India backing off from a large number of trade discussions. First, with countries with whom it had progressed a lot on, Canada. It backs off. It backs off very surprisingly with the European Union, from the European Union discussions that were taking place at that point in time. And finally, the icing on the cake is delivered by its decision to pull out of the RCEP, 2019 November. That was the final icing. So that, in a sense, was, I would say, a turning point in India's trade policy history, which now, looking back at the last 3 years, has taken a very different turn. And this very different turn is towards a period of great proactivity, engagement, whether constructive engagement or otherwise we can discuss later, but strong engagement, there's no denying the fact. So there are FTAs which have been concluded in record times. I believe the India-UAE FTA has a record of being the world's fastest concluded FTA within, 6 months of discussion, I suppose, something like that. The India-Australia ECFA has gone off into the records very fast. But there are hurdles which are coming up on the India-UK negotiations with EU. The deal with Canada should be coming through fast. There are other countries with whom India is engaging. This includes countries from the Gulf Cooperation Council, Israel. And I guess a very significant part of all this is India's participation in the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework for Prosperity, the IPEF, which in many respects, to me, is a completely new chapter in India's trade and external economic engagement, and we can talk more about that as we go ahead. What explains this change? How has all this come along? Look, I'll kind of cut the chase and get to the point from where this change actually started happening. And I think the change was the departure from RCEP. Now, the departure from RCEP was an interesting point in India's history because there are people who argue that why did India leave RCEP? And they perhaps forget to take note of the fact that this was a process with which India was invested for 7 years and 28 rounds, beginning from 2012. So obviously there was no question of being engaged with the process unless there was an expectation of something from being engaged in the process, which for a variety of reasons did not click with the projected idea of the benefits in a large number of ways when India finally took the decision. And obviously there is no denying the fact that domestic politics and external politics in both shaped up to take a very important view in the eventual decision that India took, eventually with the call that there is not substantial from the RCEP agreement which can be sold to a few prominent domestic constituencies which are virulently opposed to it, including the dairy industry and so on and so on. And secondly, the RCEP was for all practical purposes in India known as a free trade agreement with China. And given the conditions in which India and Chinese relations were at that point in time politically, it was very difficult to sell the FTA as something which would be palatable to the domestic audience. And perhaps in a way, the later events which happened thereafter, the India-China military clashes on the borders in Galwan and so on and so forth, and the fact that today the trust deficit between the two countries is at an all-time low, is a vindication of the fact that it would have been extremely, not even the hottest of hot political potatoes can be compared with that deal if India had picked it up. But this was also a pointer to a realization that when it comes to external trade engagement, at a point in time when India is aspiring to play a much bigger role in global affairs, this is something where a trade role cannot be disconnected from a political role and vice versa. And the character of India's engagement in external trade has to be viewed through a political prism. The political benefits have to be taken into consideration and matched with what were India's upcoming global aspirations. And by this time, we have had enough evidence, beginning 2020, the time when COVID struck and thereafter, there was enough evidence of India beginning to play an especially important role in this part of the world, which has now come to be characterized as the Indo-Pacific, moving on from the Asia-Pacific. And if that was something that India needed to stay locked into, as a strategic actor, then it needed to take a call on the fact that strategic influence is ultimately a product of economic influence. And that economic influence was not possible to be obtained without getting an access to the world's major markets. Those major markets, again, could only be obtained through or broken through out of a network of preferential agreements, which could be trade structured, which could be investment structured, which could be several number of other ways structured. So what you find out now is a situation where India has chosen its partners carefully. And the latest agreements are by and large mostly with the G7 countries, as well as with countries who are among India's topmost and most significant trade partners. The United Arab Emirates, for example, is India's third largest trade partner and also an extremely important partner in many other ways as a transshipment area and further intermediary functions. There's also simultaneous engagement which is happening between India and a large number of other countries which might not culminate into free trade agreements, but there's a lot of trade that India is talking from its side outside of the free trade agreements. And the biggest example of that is the Indian trade discussion with the United States, where the India-US Trade Policy Forum has actually succeeded in removing a series of obstacles which has been affecting this relationship for the last 15 years, including taking away of disputes, serious disputes, which are no longer there with the WTO and in a large number of other areas. And finally, again, I come back to the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework. This framework, this is where I conclude. This framework gives India an opportunity to come back into this region in perhaps a more significantly influential fashion than it was being provided through the RCEP. It's clearly a much bigger actor in the region now if it gets to play the kind of role that it is playing in the IPEF through regional rulemaking, which is all a question of standards. And in those areas of standards, which are the new generation standards, supply chains, clean economy, new technologies, digital economies, these are clearly going to be the areas with which the world and the region will live with in the foreseeable future. And the fact that India is getting to contribute to that rulemaking process, along with the United States and its defense and strategic partners in the region, is something which gives it the opportunity to recover a great amount of the goodwill and capital that it had perhaps lost, at least as an impressionable way, when it left the RCEP. So today it's back to re-engaging with the bulk of the ASEAN through the IPEF again constructively. It's back to talking with the rest of the RCEP members bilaterally, in fact, perhaps in a far more productive way, because many of the non-ASEAN RCEP members are also now security partners of India, notably Australia, Japan and Korea. So I think there's this very clear understanding that trade for India will no longer be an exclusive option. It will be an option which will be looked at very closely with the national security and national interest priorities, taken together with the evolving geopolitics and geoeconomics. And that requires for all of us who have been looking at Indian trade closely to start looking at trade with a different perspective. I'll stop here. To the billionaire Raj.
I'm not doing Billionaire Raj. So we sort of decided we'd split this up, that Amitendu, being the brains of the operation, would do trade policy, which is what we're meant to be talking about. I'll do
This is me. It was me too much.
I'll do a little bit of geopolitics. So I used to be at the Lee Kuan Yew School. I'm not anymore. Now I run the Asia office of the International Institute for Strategic Studies. We run the Shangri-La Dialogue. That's the thing that most people know us for, which is a big kind of regional security summit, which just happened, thankfully, very successfully about a month ago. How many? We've got 4. We've got PTI here. Who else is from India? 2. Any others? 3? Is that it? 3, 4? And how many from China? Okay. 1, 2. Okay. So, all right. So we have, I guess I will talk for 5 minutes about sort of India and China, really, and what's going on behind all of this, because as Amitendu said, there was a period of history from, 1980 to to the Great Financial Crisis, maybe just afterwards, in which trade policy, economic policy was sort of to some degree insulated from and divorced from security and geopolitics. That period is clearly over, and therefore, to a much greater degree than would have been true in the early period Amitendu was talking about, trade policy is now a kind of function of security policy, I think. And so let me talk about 2 debates, I think, which have maybe given people recently a sort of a perspective on where India is coming from in terms of its geopolitical orientation. The biggest one was what India did after Ukraine, where there was a lot of hand-wringing, particularly in Europe, because I think people misunderstood what India was really doing. There was a sense that the European audiences had expected that because over recent years India had in various different ways grown closer to the United States and European countries as it had become more threatened by China, that in the aftermath of Ukraine, India would do exactly the same thing as the Western countries did, would condemn Russian action unequivocally, would try and completely de-hitch itself from its historical relationship with Russia. India would do no such thing. It didn't think that was in its own strategic interest. It had weapons interests, oil interests. It sees its relationship with Russia as being a valuable one in the long term, in part because it gives it some leverage with respect to China. But what you didn't see in the aftermath of that, and I think this is the sort of the main lesson, which is watch what India does as opposed to what Mr. Jaishankar, the External Affairs Minister, says. He is a past master at kind of poking the West in the eye and is often willing to call out Western hypocrisy. The West has got perfect large amounts of hypocrisy to go around, so there's a rich target. But if you look at what happened in the aftermath of Ukraine, India continued to grow closer to the United States, its Quad partners in Asia, the European countries, and select others, including, the United Arab Emirates and others. So there hasn't been any change in India's general direction, which is to grow closer to the US and its partners as it has become more threatened by China. The second debate is more of an intellectual one that has been to do with the nature of the US-India bilateral, and which was prompted by an article in Foreign Affairs magazine by Ashley Tellis in the issue before last, which was called America's Bad Bet on India. The headline was a little bit misleading, but the gist of the argument was, I don't know if Ashley Tellis is probably the most respected US citizen, but the most respected watcher of the US-India strategic relationship. And he made the point that there are some in Washington who are hopeful that India will become a kind of a full-service ally of the United States in the mold of Australia and Japan. He said there's almost no chance this is going to happen. And in particular, if the US gets itself into a fight with China over Taiwan, don't expect India to do almost anything at all. And I think that article was misread a little bit because in a sense what he was arguing was, be realistic about this. That doesn't mean that you shouldn't continue to broaden and deepen the US relationship with India, but just be aware that it has limits. As in Ukraine, there are some limits to what India perceives its own self-interest in, and it doesn't see that it has much of a self-interest in getting itself messed up in a conflict over Taiwan east of the Malacca Straits. Nonetheless, the big picture, as I read it, on India's position is that, it feels threatened by China. It felt threatened by China because of what happened in the Himalayas, continues to feel threatened. It feels threatened because China is at making repeated sort of incursions into India's strategic space in the Indian Ocean, all sorts of, that's ports in Myanmar and Bangladesh, submarines popping up in Sri Lanka, all sorts of things, sort of the prospect of Chinese aircraft carriers in India's backyard. And India is, relatively economically and militarily weaker than China, and despite what's happening with China's economy, getting more so, as in the pace of Chinese military modernization means that, China's military is improving at a rate that is faster than India's, and China's economy, off the larger base, is growing larger relatively than India's, even if India's top-line growth level is higher. And so what options does India have? Well, the kind of IR theory will tell you can do internal balancing, which is to try and improve your own economy and modernize your own military, which India is trying to do, but that alone isn't enough. And so the only thing that's left to you is external balancing, namely making stronger partnerships externally, and that's exactly what India has been doing pretty reliably over the last period. So you see lots and lots of action on the US-India bilateral. I was last in Washington in March. Everyone was very delighted with what's called ISET, which is the US-India technology-focused partnership, which is an attempt to try and refocus the relationship around the fact that both are technology leaders, which has some trade implications, but also implications in defense, for instance, as the US tries to support India's attempt to develop more of a domestic defense industry. It reflects some ambitions on electronics manufacturing and semiconductors, for those of you who cover semiconductors in Taiwan, one of you at least. There's lots of action also on the kind of reaction between the US, the relationship between India and the US allies and partners. So India, Australia, India, Japan, India, Philippines to a limited degree, and India and, as Amitendu said, the European Union. Mr. Jaishankar and indeed Mr. Modi have taken all sorts of trips to Europe. There's a view often in this part of the world that the Europeans aren't really worth bothering with in security terms, but India's behavior would suggest otherwise, that in a sense they're trying to deepen relations with the European Union itself, with France, Germany, and the United Kingdom as the larger of the European countries, but actually with a lot of the smaller European countries as well. I mean, Mr. Modi went to Scandinavia to have a summit with the Scandinavian leaders. They go to all of the smaller countries as well. So there's been a real push. And I think fundamentally a lot of this is down to China. So final point is, well, where does that leave the US-China bilateral relationship? There was an interesting article in The Economist either last week or the week before, I don't know if anyone saw this, which basically speculated on the idea that the India-China relationship may be about to improve, as in they might find a way of solving the remaining issues on the border after the clashes that happened a couple of years ago, which were the beginning of all of this. It's an interesting sort of counterfactual. I don't agree with it, and not very many people I saw seem to agree with it. I mean, it seemed to be more speculation than fact. At the moment, you have quite a different view of the India-China bilateral, where, to put it very crudely, we had a gathering recently of government officials from both sides, and if I were to characterize it, the Chinese attitude has been that really there isn't that much of a problem here. India and China should be able to, sort of solve their problems. The border is mostly stable. I think to some degree underneath this, China feels India is being manipulated by the United States to make too much of the differences. So that's the sort of Chinese view, is that, there are ways around these problems. We're both Asian countries. We can come to agreements. The Indian view is that there is a big problem, that nothing else is going to get sorted until the border is sorted, and there are all sorts of things in the way that China is behaving that India doesn't really like very much. So it's always possible that you could get an improvement in bilateral relations. The bilateral ties between the two have gone up and down over time. They fought a war in 1962. Sometimes they've been very friendly with one another. So I don't want to discount it entirely, but it seems to me that it's not very likely that there's going to be a kind of transformative improvement in India-China ties. And there's always the prospect that, it could get worse. Within the last 2 or 3 years, India and China very nearly fought a war in the Himalayas. And the action that both sides take on the border is quite unstable, in much the same way as there's instability in the rest of the region. So it's always possible that accidents could happen. So my sense is, that India and China remain in a reasonably tense position, and that the trade relationship that Amitendu has been talked about is set against this backdrop in which India has made a strategic decision that, although it's not going to kind of go all in with its new friends and partners, that it is seeking across a whole range of policy areas, from economics to hard security, to deepen ties with the United States principally, but also Australia and Japan in the Quad, the Europeans, and then a sort of selection of other high-value nations, of which some in Southeast Asia and the GCC countries are the others. And let me stop there, and then we can kind of open it up to questions.
We heard from Steve Olson earlier this week, and he said that if Donald Trump is reelected, he expects the U.S. to pull out of IPEF basically immediately. Just wondering if you all had any comment on that, or what the 2024 election could mean.
Steve and I have a on that, so we will wait for Donald Trump to get elected or re-elected. Then I'll come back to that, yeah.
Hi, I'm Chia-Pek Wong, Executive Editor from Channel News Asia. So I have this question, bringing it back to trade flows. So there are all these various forecasts about India becoming, the third largest economy by 2030, world's second largest economy by 2075, if you listen to Goldman Sachs. So, India seems to be doing all these right things, making friends around the world, kind of a bit different from China. So how will that affect overall trade flows, especially when if you talk about all the trade flows for us in Singapore, we are benefiting mainly because China, all the major goods do flow down towards us, to the rest of the world. But India would be on the other side. So how would that affect international trade flows as India grows bigger? And also how would that affect Singapore as still one of the world's top 10 busiest ports? Thank you.
I'll let Amitendu answer on the details of that. There's two things kind of in that question, one of which is about India's growth and the other of which is about supply chain decoupling, and they're sort of separate phenomenons, or de-risking, etc. So you should probably tease them apart. At a very high level, if India's growth continues on the path that it is, I suppose we would expect global trade to become more India-focused. And one way, so if you look at Ricardo Hausmann's work on complexity at Harvard, he has long predicted that over the medium term, you will see the sort of Indo-African rim become a more important center of global trade and economic growth and dynamism. So the east coast of Africa, the GCC countries, and India, as opposed to the sort of Pacific rim, which has been the driver of growth. So I presume as India becomes a more important sort of part of the pie and more connected from a trade perspective, you'll simply see more of the flows going through India, more of the intermediate goods as India moves into those areas. Amitendu, what's your sense?
Yeah, thanks, James. But before I come to you, Chia-Pek, let me just answer what the question that Anne pointed out here, the Donald Trump business. See, and I think the United States chose the IPEF and its framework very carefully, knowing fully well that the current United States policy is on trade is completely allergic to the mention of the phrase FTA. There's no FTA that's being talked about in the US trade policy anywhere. So as a result of that, the IPEF, much as the rest of the world find it's very difficult to understand, the IPEF has been repeatedly proposed as a framework which is not a free trade agreement. Now, there are certain, I would say, institutional implications. First, President Biden doesn't have the fast-track authority on the FTAs, so there's no point from the US administration in getting into an FTA, which cannot be taken to the Congress, and if it's taken to the Congress, it gets stuck. The second is that this is something which is characteristically being proposed as a voluntary arrangement with sufficient degree of flexibility, in the sense that even India has not joined all the pillars of the IPEF It stayed out of the trade pillar and joined the remaining three pillars. And within the pillars, from what we have got to understood till now, at the end of the Singapore round and what was announced in Detroit in May, the supply chains agreement gives sufficient flexibility to countries in terms of locking into some features and staying out of the others. I think the by and large overall policy of the Biden administration on this is to finish this off as a domestic decision by the end of this year and not leave it to the future or the unpredictability of the future in terms of a new government, a new president coming in and derailing the whole process. So by and large, if standards are set, they're expected to largely remain set. And even if the US backs out of the process at that point in time, after about a year or a year and a half, it will not stop the US actors from staying engaged in the process which has been set in. So I think that's the deeper thinking, and on that, Steve and I will have more conversations as we go on.
How much is the bet?
Not to be disclosed. Okay, so on your question, Chiapik, look, I think it's very interesting you raised this point. If you look at the China story, for example, if you look at the India story, the China story is a complete outlier to the way we have always understood economic growth in the world, because China has imperfections. And technically, an economy with the kind of imperfections that China has should not have achieved the kind of growth rate that it has. Subsequently, similar growth rates have been shown by India. They have been shown by a country like Bangladesh. They have been shown by Turkey. They have been shown by many other countries. These are countries which are showing the ability to grow very fast without a corresponding increase in their per capita incomes. It's not necessarily that a high growth for the economy is getting translated into commensurate growth and betterment of standard of living for all individuals. It's happening selectively. It's happening within the country. So what that means is that the old ideas that we have always attached to trade, that countries will trade on the basis of their comparative advantages, they will trade on the basis of their resource endowments, they are perhaps required to be looked at afresh. When you raise the question of India, I always look at India as a country which is probably going to make a huge contribution to the world economy, not through manufacturing at large, and I'm choosing my words very carefully, not manufacturing at large, but selectively in manufacturing, but largely in services. Today, this is a country which has more than, estimates vary, but I think roughly almost 2/3 of the Indian economy comprises of services. And there is a lot of talk, including economists like me, who have always argued that, look, this transition from agriculture to services is a very difficult transition. There has to be agriculture from where it has to move on to labor-intensive manufacturing. That's the East Asian flying geese model, You move on to labor-intensive manufacturing, you move on to higher value-additive manufacturing, then you move on to services. In India's case, that has not happened, and it's unlikely to happen. So there are two things that are going to happen. India is going to make a substantive contribution to global services. And those global services are not just in the form of services that we normally know and talk about. It's not just transport services. There's going to be a lot of movement coming out from the Indian people in terms of education, in terms of tourism, in terms of movement of professionals, which has happened and will keep happening. And that's going to be a net foreign exchange generator for India. And perhaps for those countries who are able to utilize those assets, number one. Number two, where I see the India-Singapore relationship, or for example, countries like Singapore, for that matter, you would even take the example of Hong Kong, you take the example of Dubai, you could perhaps to some extent, if matters work right, perhaps, countries like cities like Sydney and so on. There's an intermediary complementarity which happens between these countries. I'll just give you an example. One of the most prominent areas of Indian intervention, policy intervention, over the last 1 year has been to shift a certain part of Indian trade to be invoiced in rupee, which is Indian country. Now, what does this mean? It is obviously responding to an opportunity, right? After the Ukraine development, what has happened across the world is that the cost of dollar has gone up enormous. And countries with whom India is trading, most of them, including India, are invoicing the trade in dollars. But the cost of exchanging local currencies for dollar is very large on part of both countries. So the matter becomes simpler if the rupee is accepted as a currency. But the problem over here is that the institutional mechanisms have been set up. There are called these Vostro accounts, which have been established in banks, through which the rupee accounts can be maintained. The problem is, what does a foreign dealer do with the rupee that he or she gets? It doesn't have any use anywhere else. So that use can enlarge only if the rupee becomes a more globally accepted currency. That cannot happen in the form in which it exists right now, but perhaps can happen as a digital form. So you get to see these intermediation stations becoming more and more active in an Indian strategy. Working with Singapore, for example, you get the Pay Now and the UPI interface operating seamlessly. You get to see the same happening in Dubai and Abu Dhabi. Malaysia has accepted the rupee trade. Indonesia is going to move on to it pretty soon. So there is, I think, a larger plan that when it comes to one after the other, the Indian rupee is going to be an enabler in pushing the kind of trade character and structure which suits India. And by the way, this is also strategic. I mean, the Chinese experience has shown us politically the extremely critical role that diaspora plays in determining country-to-country relations. And there is no reason why the Indian diaspora should not play that role if they are backed with the right economic instruments. Something like the rupee, for example, or other factors which enables them to perform the kind of role which India has sort of seen happening elsewhere in the world. So to kind of broadly conclude to the point that you raised, I think for the foreseeable future, what we are going to see is we are going to see growth coming out from India. There's no denying the fact. India's ability to be a consumer for final products will remain very large, because in spite of the gaps within the country itself, there's probably 5 to 10% of the population in India which has enormous purchasing power, both as a consuming class as well as a back-end producing class. So there will continue to be a market for final products. It will take time before India gets embedded into strategic supply chains. Semiconductors, for example, is going to take time. But I think there's something to be noted when you see certain responses. I mean, this is for the first time I saw the United States president expressing so much of exuberance over a purchase order that has been placed by an organization called the Air India, which a year ago was supposed to go bankrupt. Now it suddenly turns around and places an order for 470 Airbus and Boeing aircrafts, and it says that will create these many jobs in the United States. So I think that's where the synergy has changed in a different direction. And probably that's what's going to significantly transform the trade flows. I'm not sure if I was able to respond to what you wanted to know, but...
Hi, I'm Shagun. I work with the Down to Earth magazine in India. So you talked about the overview of India's history with FTAs and how it backed out from RCEP at the last moment after negotiations with for 7 years. So that has mostly come out of the protectionist fears that India has. But now coming to the present situation, it's more friendly with FTAs. But is India still a reliable trading partner? Like, does the world see it that way? Because just for example, last year, when Modi, I think, went to US and said that if WTO allows, we will feed the world. But then just in the same month, during the Russia-Ukraine conflict, it banned export of wheat, whereas the world was facing like a lot of wheat shortage. So there was a lot of talk about if India could be a reliable trading partner, and how does the world see India currently?
Can I answer that with a counter question? On the sin. I mean, being Indians, I can understand how that...
Yeah, I mean, this is Manas. I work for PTI. So there's been two views. I mean, I have also seen that in fact, India is still being seen as a very difficult market to operate. In the last few years, a number of auto majors have pulled out of India, including General Motors and Ford. And a number of foreign companies have pulled out of India. So do you think, in fact, India needs to, have adequate reform still, in fact, to be rolled out? And in our FTA negotiations also, we have seen two phases. In the first 4 or 5 years of Modi government, there are very critical remarks, even by the foreign minister, that we don't need FTAs. But in the last 3-4 years, we have seen a plethora of FTAs being formed up or are being formed up. So do you think India has been sending mixed signals? Because we started preliminary discussions about an FTA with Taiwan in 2013. Still, in fact, Taiwan has been actually pushing for negotiations on the FTA, but still New Delhi is learned to be very reluctant to just go ahead with the FTA. So do you think India needs to actually have clarity of its approach in doing business with many countries?
Thank you for these questions. Look, let me put it this way. I mean, you mentioned reliability, right? I'm not exactly sure who in the eyes of the rest of the world is a reliable trade partner. I don't think the United States is. If the United States was, then Anne wouldn't have raised that question, which Steve, given his tons of years of experience with US trade negotiation, possesses. There's always the problem of going back on the commitments. India-UK FTA negotiations, for example, the problem has been more on the UK side. I mean, there were commitments which were declared and there was a change of government. So subsequently, the negotiating postures have changed. I think when it involves looking at countries which are as complex as India is, and where those complexities are actually given expression, it's very difficult to handle a trade policy, because a trade policy at the end of the day involves everybody. And the biggest problem of political legitimacy of a trade policy is that the benefits from trade show up in a much lesser, inconsequential way than the costs of trade. If you open up, you can immediately build up a case that, look, we opened up so many imports come in, these industries lost their jobs. But it will take a hell of a lot of time for you and persuasion to make people understand that after opening up, you started getting imports which are cheap and those benefited your consumers. It's not rocket science. It doesn't happen in a one-on-one fashion. So the problem that India now faces, and I think this is a problem which it has always faced. I mean, you being from the PTI, Manas, you will know. When the India-EU negotiations were called off in 2017, those were called off on the basis of the fact that there were tremendous oppositions that came from the automobile manufacturers, from the wine manufacturers, and a large number of other domestic manufacturers. But there was a group, and I'm specifically referring to the garment clusters in Turupur and other places, who were ecstatic about this FTA. And if that FTA had gone in by this time, the South Asian economic story would have been different. You might not have had Bangladesh becoming the largest exporter of garments to EU. You might have actually seen India being very close to that position, the preferential access. And today, Bangladesh is having to regret the fact that once the LDC status goes, this everything but arms access goes, right? In India's case, it would not have been the LDC status, but there would have been bilateral preferential access, which you lost. And today, there's nothing which is going to give you that access unless you compromise. And where do you compromise? The EU's area of interest will be very different. You need to look out for data security. And you might argue that why should we give data security? Why should we align to the GDPR? Now, my point over there is that you don't have to align with the GDPR, but what else can you align with? Is there an alternative to the GDPR? It's like saying the WTO is bad, but what is better? Because you don't have an alternative to the WTO. So I think in this respect, these challenges will always remain with India. There's no way these challenges are going to go. Negotiating with India is always going to be a tricky position. And I think this is something which has actually been understood very well by a country like the United States. So today, when the United States engages with India on trade, it actually doesn't go through a formally pre-announced structured framework. It takes to talking much more with concerned actors who are in the process, the companies, the other stakeholders, and as a result of which there's a certain degree of confidence building which is required in the process. The second point over here is that I think India, and I'm referring to Indian negotiators with whom I have had long chats on this subject, Indian negotiators have a degree of discomfort with a certain kind of trade issues which they're not comfortable handling. For example, if you look at the treatment of state-owned enterprises, which features prominently in today's trading, the digital economy, that hesitation arises from the fact that in India you don't have the regulations. What are you going to negotiate on the back of? Today, if you are supposed to discuss the framework for interoperable, cross-border data flows, what the IPEF is discussing, India is hemmed in by the fact that it don't yet have a domestic regulation which governs cross-border data flows. So what is the Indian position going to be on the subject? I think we must appreciate the limitations under which Indian negotiators also work, aside of the politics, aside of the turf issues. We know that the Indian trade policy making space is still very much dictated by silos. There's no integrable approach to this, which perhaps will come. But yes, I accept the fact that negotiating with India will remain a challenge. But I think the nature of these challenges are changing. Now the challenge is expected to be much more coming in from the perspective of a country which is trying to pick up a strategy of learning by doing. And it is always going to be a case where in India, the eventual decisions will have to come from the topmost layer of the political decision making. That's where the game lies.
Hello, this is Xiaoyan from China Business News based in Shanghai. So my question is, despite of the tense political relations and decoupling efforts, the China and the Indian bilateral trade still see two-digit increase in the past few years, especially Chinese export to India. So my question is, do you think the increase will to be continue or will be stopped in just a few years? Thank you.
James is the China expert.
Well, that's a different question, though, isn't it? I mean, it's you're right that the bilateral trade is growing. Could continue to grow. The two economies are complementary. It depends, I think, the extent to which India is successful in replicating some of the many things that it imports from China, because it's mostly trade going one way, right? I mean, if you look at the line items being exported from India, then there's some high-end services, but it's a lot of more basic commodities. So, but I think a lot of that will hang on what happens with the bilateral relationship at the higher level. I mean, I think that's when you see. If you go back and read that Economist article, the increase in trade is one of the sort of predicates for an argument that a rapprochement would be in both sides' interests, which economically it would be. But I think the question is that going to be enough? And I suspect it isn't. I mean, the Indian side know that there's, the investment from China. It would be helpful to have Chinese infrastructure providers. I mean, India has a number of enormous challenges. The climate transition is one. The move from a rural to a more urban society is another. And both of those are areas where China has some expertise that it could share. So it's unquestionable that there are sort of gains to be had through trade. But all of that has to be seen through the prism of national security competition. So I think that's the kind of more important question. I don't know, Amitendu, are you long on India-China trade?
I will just respond to that by taking reference to a simple point. I think at the end of the day, both India and China realize that geography cannot change. Look, they have to coexist with each other. The history also will not change, and the history is not showing much signs of changing. The trade relationship is something which has developed over the years. It cannot change over time. My short answer to your question is that I do expect India-China trade to continue in a fairly robust fashion for at least a few more years, till the time during which India develops sufficient domestic capacities for switching from some of the imports where its reliance on China is heavy. But there are imports over which India certainly has a fear that greater dependency can have a bearing on national security interests. And I think these are the areas where India will try to slowly wean away from its dependence from China. Now, look, I want to make one point here. It's obviously China-India's relationship is very, very complicated. But I think if you take that complication out, if you just look at this factor, that if a country like India, or for that matter, has high dependency on another country in sourcing, that dependency, given the circumstances, given the imperatives, can always be quote-unquote weaponized and utilized for geopolitical advantages. So that's something which nobody will want to come into. I mean, that perhaps happens even for a country like Taiwan, that perhaps happens even for China's instance with other countries with whom it has a dependency on import of certain products. So monopoly independency is not acceptable. It's not the best way to go. So I think the India-China trade in a large way will remain robust, but you are not going to perhaps see that robustness continue in certain areas like, for example, telecom equipments, where there is a clear decision on part of India to shift away and diversify its import products. It's likely to remain strong maybe in areas like fertilizers, chemicals. Still sufficient capacities are developed at the Indian end to exist. And I think there is also this understanding that the India-China relationship has a complication which is very difficult to understand for external actors. I mean, it's not something that, other countries with whom China has difficult relations will immediately understand nuances of this relationship. It's very complex, it's politically, yet there is engagement. So I think that dichotomy has to be taken on in full to understand what is the complication. So the fact that trade continues despite disturbances on the other side is a reflection on that dichotomy.
Hi, as Wen Yili from Business Weekly from Taiwan. So just curious because I've seen the U.S. commerce have been actively talking with India for supply chain issues, and then they want to regard India as an alternative to China. But I was wondering, how do you see the U.S.-India relationship is going to maybe bring some changes to U.S.-Taiwan to India-Taiwan relationship? Because there's a lot of actually electronic suppliers that are Taiwanese and they're moving out of China right now.
You want to take a shot?
I think India, just very briefly, India will be very cautious about. India has been cautious for historical reasons about building stronger ties with Taiwan because of the bigger India-China relationship. India sees China as a threat, but it doesn't want to kind of antagonize China unnecessarily because China then has the capability of holding various Indian interests at risk. And this, goes right back to the period prior to the 1962 war, which was also the period in the late 1950s in which there was a sort of tumultuous period in cross-strait relations. And for some Indian strategists, the fact that the US kind of took the temperature down in Taiwan was a precipitating factor for China's willingness to consider a military conflict with India in 1962. So people remember this. I don't think India is going to do anything rash on the security side. But, as you say, there's a lot of interest in India, and Amitendu can speak to this in more depth, on the technology side. To get to Manash's point, this is going to be an up and down journey. You just saw Foxconn, I think it was, cancel its partnership with Vedanta. Quite why they thought they were going to make semiconductors with Vedanta anyway sort of seemed mad to me. This is a funny company. But so the challenge of managing this kind of economic technological relationship, I think you do see some of the more hawkish voices in the Indian strategic community sort of saying that India should do more with Taiwan economically now. And really they're saying that as a kind of signal to China, as in, don't push us around because like the US, we can do things with Taiwan. But I think India will be cautious in doing that while trying to develop the partnerships that it needs to develop these electronics and ultimately, hopefully for them, bits of the semiconductor supply chain? What's your sense?
No, I think, James, you have a point over there. I think ultimately this will actually come down to very, very cold-blooded business pragmatism. Look, let me give an example. And James alluded to Foxconn. The story has been doing the rounds. And there is talk coming out whether the Foxconn Vedanta scrapping off of the deal is a reflection of the Indian ecosystem and how conducive it is for future growth of semiconductors. Well, there are gaps in Indian ecosystem. But I think this particular decision had probably had much more to do with the Vedanta's financial conditions as a partner for going ahead rather than as a reflection on the general ecosystem. Now, having said that, semiconductor is obviously something with which India would want to work very closely with Taiwan. India is not an exception. There are other countries, the US, Koreans, all of them want to work closely with Taiwan. The point over here is that if one looks closely at the semiconductor supply chain, that is where India now stands at a relative disadvantage because India is much way down in the supply chain, essentially at the assembly end. There are very few countries in the world, or very few businesses to be specific, which actually brings in the kind of capacity in advanced processing chips like the TSMC does. But where India, I think, has been able to build a connection is through the Apple ecosystem and working closely with Foxconn, Wistron, and Pegatron. But that's at one level. At some level, bringing the entire Apple ecosystem into India, which India is looking to do, would involve bringing the Tier 1 and Tier 2 suppliers of Foxconn, Pegatron, and Wistron into India as well. And many of those suppliers are from the Chinese mainland.
Do you have time for one last question? Oh, I'm so sorry.
Sorry. So this is something which will need to be looked at very closely. I don't think India is actually going to look at this as a Taiwan issue. It is going to very specifically look at this as a very, very practical, long-lasting business issue.
Last one.
Okay. I am Pradipta. I work for Forecast News. I'm based in India. So we have all this positivity around India's growth. Goldman Sachs saying that India would become the second largest economy, overtaking even US. And then we have International Monetary Fund saying that China and India would drive growth in Asia Pacific this year. But all this positivity, do you think it could be an exaggeration considering India's latest unemployment is at 16-month high at 8.3%? Do you think it's possible?
I don't think there is any issue with the growth. I think the concern is with the character of the growth. The growth may not necessarily be job-inducing, and it is very unlikely to be. So I think when it comes to a statistical understanding of growth, purely generation economic activities, sectors expanding, yes, that growth will very much be there. But it's not necessarily that growth will translate into commensurate number of employment opportunities, because I think that character of economic growth for India has changed very substantially. I'm not exactly sure how many countries of the world can today claim to have that kind of growth, because the sectors which are growth inducing are typically sectors which are no longer employment inducing. So there is a strong dichotomy that has come in this regard, because that role of labor-intensive manufacturing has gradually receded. And India's case, for example, you perhaps know better than me that we have seen sectors like hospitality, F&B, tourism, generating enormous amount of, I would say, opportunities. But whether they're actually generating employment is a different question, because we are getting to understand employment in a very different way. I think our perceptions will also change once we get to see data coming out kind of employment assessment where the gig economy is brought into consideration. There's a great number of gig economy and platform workers who today are engaged in economic operations in India and a large number of activities. I don't think we are still in a position to see what exactly has been the employment implication of the gig economy. Perhaps when we go back and assess it carefully, our views on the employment will be a little different statistically.
Very interesting. Thank you both so much for being here and taking some extra time. Thank you.
Thank you.